Okay, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're putting on our detective hats and stepping into the shoes of theological researchers to examine the historical origins of some of the world's most influential texts. Now, we aren't here to debate personal faith or belief. Instead, we're going to look closely at the actual textual evidence, the physical manuscript history, to see exactly what the fingerprints of the past can tell us. So, how do scholars actually determine the historical reliability of ancient sacred texts? Well, researchers have to look past theological claims and examine the actual paper trail left behind history. We're talking about analyzing the dates of manuscripts, looking for historical corroboration of the details within them, and, perhaps most importantly, using something called source criticism. That's basically just a scholarly way of saying we trace where certain stories and ideas originally came from. The starting point for this specific investigation is a really fascinating foundational claim regarding the Quran. It's a theological concept known as nazil. Basically, this is the belief that the text is an eternal, uncreated document that was literally brought down from heaven, dictated perfectly word for word in the 7th century. By definition, a nazil text should be completely free of human influence, earthly sourcing, or scribal errors. Let's map this out historically. When researchers plot the origins of these Judeo-Christian traditions on a timeline, the source material points out a pretty stark historical reliability gap. You've got the life events of Jesus around 30 AD, followed closely by the canonical Gospels written in the 1st century. But then, centuries later, mostly between the 2nd and 5th centuries, we see this huge surge of unverified apocryphal fables and folklore. And finally, way down the line in the 7th century, the Quran is recorded. The investigation highlights that the earlier texts are heavily grounded in history. The New Testament manuscripts, for example, are tied tightly to the 1st century. They're anchored by incredibly verifiable details. To give you an idea of the scale here, classical scholars have confirmed 84 specific historical and geographical details in just the last 16 chapters of the Book of Acts alone. Add in manuscript fragments dating all the way back to 125 AD and discoveries like the Dead Sea Scrolls, and researchers see an incredibly precise, unbroken chain of textual transmission over the centuries. Which brings up a massive question for scholars. How do we explain the presence of much later, unhistorical stories suddenly appearing in a 7th century text that claims to be a perfect confirmation of those original scriptures? I mean, these are stories that appear completely out of historical place. That brings us to Section 1, Tracing External Influences and the Paper Trail of Source Criticism. Let's trace the exact fingerprints of where these out-of-place narratives actually originated before they showed up in the 7th century Arabian Peninsula. When researchers systematically catalog these anomalous stories, a really clear pattern emerges. They perfectly mirror pre-existing apocryphal legends and Near Eastern folklore that were already circulating orally in Arabia during the 7th century. For instance, the source material notes that the text merges the identities of Mary, the mother of Jesus, with Miriam, the sister of Moses. Interestingly, that's a character merger first seen in the 2nd century Proto-Evangelium of James. What about the story of a great iron wall built to keep out Gog and Magog? That mirrors the 6th century Syriac Alexander legend. And the narrative of the Companions of the Cave is a direct reflection of a 5th century Christian legend known as the Syriac Acts of the Seven Sleepers. And this perfectly illustrates the textual borrowing. In the Quranic text, we have descriptions of Jesus speaking from the cradle and breathing life into clay birds. And then we have a source text called the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, written back in the 2nd century. The details match almost word for word. It's uncanny. But here is the really crucial piece of the puzzle. These apocryphal sources, like that Infancy Gospel of Thomas, were never considered historical by early Christians. They were universally rejected as fictional forgeries, basically entertaining fan fiction written hundreds of years after Jesus lived. Yet source analysis points out that these exact stories are presented as factual, historical reality centuries later. Moving right along to Section 2, the rabbinic commentary error and the Mishnah Sanhedrin connection. This might actually be the most compelling piece of evidence in our entire textual investigation. In the 2nd century, a Jewish rabbi wrote a subjective commentary in the Talmud, specifically in the Mishnah Sanhedrin. He was commenting on Genesis 4, where God says to Cain, "The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me." Now, the Hebrew word for blood used there was plural. Because of that weird grammatical quirk, the rabbi poetically reasoned that killing one person is like killing a whole world of people, because you destroy all their potential descendants. When researchers compare the texts, they point out something absolutely astonishing. Surah 532 states exactly this, that whoever kills a soul, it is as if he had slain mankind entirely. Critics argue that the text inadvertently incorporated this Jewish rabbi's specific human commentary on a grammatical quirk. But it presents it not as a rabbi's musings, but as a direct command from the divine. The historical context of the rabbi's exposition was completely lost in oral transmission, and the human commentary was simply absorbed as scripture. The investigation also uncovers what scholars call severe historical anachronisms, things that are completely out of place in time. For example, referencing Joseph being sold for dirhams, which were Persian silver points, but the era of Joseph predated the invention of coined money by over a millennium, or placing a Samaritan at Mount Sinai making the golden calf, centuries before the Samaritan people even existed. It even places a man named Haman in Egypt as an advisor to Pharaoh, when the historical Haman lived 1,000 years later in Persia. Scholars argue these anachronisms strongly point to an author retrojecting contemporary 7th century knowledge and oral mix-ups back into ancient history. Which brings us to our final section, implications for divine origin and the theological collision. So when we step back, what do researchers believe these textual fingerprints actually mean for the foundational claims of the text itself? This creates what the source material refers to as a profound theological collision, or the Islamic dilemma. The Quran repeatedly affirms the previous scriptures, the Torah and the Gospel, as true, uncorrupted revelations from God, telling its listeners to judge by what is in them. But at the exact same time, it contradicts the most fundamental historical and theological claims of those very same texts. The most glaring example of this is the crucifixion. Modern historians, secular, Jewish, and Christian alike, unanimously agree based on the first-century evidence that Jesus was crucified by the Romans. Yet the 7th century text claims he wasn't, saying it was merely made to appear so. Once again, when we trace the fingerprints, researchers find this exact illusion or substitution theory in the writings of 2nd century Gnostic sects, who believed Jesus didn't actually have a physical body. So the text adopts a later heresy over the established 1st century historical consensus. Ultimately, the source authors argue that these textual discrepancies fundamentally challenge that core claim of Nazil. Think about it. If a text is truly an eternal, uncreated document flawlessly dictated by the divine, it simply shouldn't inadvertently contain borrowed 2nd century human folklore, local Arab oral mix-ups, and the subjective scribal errors of Jewish rabbis. I'm going to leave you with this thought to chew on. When we really examine the paper trail, researchers find a rich tapestry of borrowed ideas, contemporary legends, and human commentary. When human history and divine claims collide on the manuscript page, which one do the fingerprints actually point to? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep asking great questions.